Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video, or welcome if you are new to my channel. Today we're back with another true crime case, but this one is different to any other I've done so far. Rather than doing like a gruesome murder case, I've decided to do itchy nose, a con fraud case. I find these just as fascinating. Today's story is about Elizabeth Holmes and the company Theranos. If you've never heard of it, well, you're about to find out all about it, so sit back, relax, and let's dive in. So, Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on February 3rd in 1984 in Washington, D.C. to Father Christian and Mother Noel. Christian was Vice President for the Clean Energy Solutions Group, which is a subsidiary of the American energy company Enron. So he earned good money and they lived in a wealthy neighborhood, which is where Elizabeth grew up. According to Elizabeth, she was really close with her uncle, but sadly he would eventually get diagnosed with skin cancer that actually ended up spreading to his brain and took his life at a pretty young age, meaning he never got to see his children grow up. And Elizabeth said that this really affected her. She was devastated, and she uses this story about her uncle as reasoning for wanting to start the company that she goes on to create, Theranos, and ends up being a complete farce. And now at some point in childhood, Elizabeth and her family moved to Texas, where Elizabeth attended St. John's High School in Houston. During high school, she was interested in computer programming and claims that this is when she started her first business, selling C++ compilers to Chinese universities, which are programs that translate computer codes. At this point, she's also started having private Mandarin tutor lessons at home, and I imagine she did this because of her business connections with Chinese universities and thinking it would help her future in business, potentially with Chinese companies. And Mandarin is a very hard language to learn. It's not easy, and so it shows that Elizabeth is smart and she's also very determined, especially at this young age. And Elizabeth actually started talking about becoming successful from a very young age. At only 5 years old, when family or friends would ask her what she wanted to do for a living, she would say that she wanted to become a billionaire. I don't think I even knew the word billionaire at 5. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing. She also knew that she wanted to create something that would change the world. In a letter that she wrote to her father when she was a child, she wrote, "What I want out of life is to discover something new, something that mankind didn't know was possible." So she's always had big ambitions. By the middle of high school, her Mandarin was really good, and so she wanted to attend Stanford's Mandarin Chinese summer program. And she managed to convince Stanford to allow her to attend these by speaking Mandarin to the professors, to the dean of the school, and so they allowed her to attend, and she started taking college courses all whilst she was still in high school. In 2001, 2001, Elizabeth enrolled in Stanford full-time, where she studied chemical engineering and also worked as a student researcher and lab assistant in the engineering school. Then after her freshman year, Elizabeth went on to work in a lab at the Genome Institute of Singapore. Apparently, Elizabeth had a bit of a hard time in Stanford socially. She got bullied and struggled to make connections. Then in 2002, at the age of just 18, Elizabeth met a man named Sunny Balwani, whose real name is actually Ramesh, but he had started going by Sunny when they met. And he was about 37 years old. And he was a Silicon Valley technology entrepreneur with quite a lot of business experience and wealth under his belt. He was also married when they first met, so they became just friends. But it wasn't long before he divorced his wife, and then he and Elizabeth started dating. And in 2005, they moved in together. Now, Sunny was not invited to join the company Theranos officially until 2009, but he was actually very much involved behind the scenes, helping Elizabeth with the company from the beginning. One of Elizabeth's first ideas was a patch that you put on your skin, and it would deliver antibiotics transdermally when it detected infection. However, it turns out that this is just not possible to do, so that idea was quickly abandoned. But it didn't take long before she had her next big idea, and this is the one that goes on to get her into a lot of trouble. In March of 2004, she dropped out of Stanford School of Engineering and used the rest of her tuition money to fund her next idea, a consumer healthcare technology company called Real-Time Cures, which she said was going to democratize healthcare. And her new invention was in part inspired by her fear and many other people's fear of needles. Elizabeth actually described having blood taken as torture because she hated needles so much, so she came up with the idea that just a small finger prick's worth of blood could be sufficient enough to run almost every diagnostic test under the sun. So rather than having to have multiple vials of blood taken for testing, like they usually do when you go to a doctor, she posed that just a drop of blood would be enough. She spoke to her medical professor, Phyllis Gardner, about her idea, but Phyllis said, "I'm sorry, but this isn't going to be possible." But Elizabeth kept talking about it and was saying that she thinks it's a great idea that could work. She ended up pitching the idea to multiple medical professors, and they all said the same thing: "I'm sorry, but this is impossible. It simply will not work." But Elizabeth refused to take no for an answer, and somehow she ended up managing to convince the dean and advisor at the School of Engineering, Channing Robertson, to back her idea and support her. So Elizabeth went on to create the machine that would do these blood tests from a very small amount of blood She also claimed that the Edison would prevent a lot of deaths because it would be able to detect diseases early. And during her marketing campaign for the Edison and Theranos, she would say that she envisions a world where no one ever has to say goodbye too soon. And this kind of became her catchphrase, which she would repeat over and over again in almost every media appearance that she did. In 2004, Elizabeth decided to change her company name from Real Time Cures to Theranos, and Theranos is a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. And she changed it because a lot of people are skeptical of the word cure, which they are. Like, if you're claiming to cure something, I think that immediately makes people question. And so she thought that would go against her growing the company, so she changed it to Theranos. Elizabeth began renting the basement of a group college house and some lab space to start growing the company. And surprisingly, she started attracting investors quite quickly without any proof that her idea of the Edison actually worked. The first major investor was Tim Draper, who was actually the father of Elizabeth's childhood friend Jessie, and he was a Silicon Valley venture capitalist who invested in companies such as Skype, Hotmail, and many others. Elizabeth was able to convince him that her idea was going to work and that her company was a sound investment, and so he wrote Elizabeth a check for $1 million. And according to Tim, Elizabeth also received support and investment from Rupert Murdoch, who was a very successful entrepreneur in the media industry, the Walton family, who are the founders of Walmart and Sam's Club, and the Cox family of Cox Enterprises. The first member of the Theranos board was Secretary of State George Shultz, and he ended up bringing in 12 other big names to be members on the board as well, including former Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. And by December of 2004, Elizabeth had raised $6 million for Theranos, and by the end of 2010, Theranos had $92 million in venture capital, which is just incredible that she's managed to conjure up all this interest in her technology when she didn't even have any medical or engineering qualifications, because she dropped out of school to start the company. So she actually only had a high school diploma at this point. And she hadn't proved that her machine could work either. But I guess people loved the idea. It would be cool if it could work. During this time, she ran Theranos in what she called stealth mode. She employed lots of people, and a lot of them were actually former Apple employees, one of them being Avi Devanian, who was Steve Jobs' right-hand man, as well as Anna Ariola, who designed the iPhone. Now, Elizabeth had a bit of an obsession with Steve Jobs. I think she idolized him, and so she began trying to emulate him by making black turtleneck tops her staple wardrobe, so she looked just like Steve Jobs in what she was wearing when she was seen in public or in the media. She also donned red lipstick as her staple look, and she even began speaking in a different tone of voice. She deepened her voice to sound more masculine, probably because she's in an industry where it's very male dominated, and so she thought maybe she would get taken more seriously if she had more of a masculine energy. And you can even see in interviews that she tries to sit in a manly way and just tries to carry herself in a very masculine manner. And her voice, you can tell it's put on. There's no way her voice is naturally that deep. It must have hurt to do as well all the time. Eventually, Elizabeth gave a presentation of the Edison machine at the global healthcare company Novartis in Switzerland. But this demonstration was completely fake. She actually had one of her computer technicians write a piece of code to make it look like the Edison was working when actually it wasn't doing anything. So during this presentation, she's showing it in action, but it's not actually doing anything. There's just some code making it look like the machine is doing something when it isn't. So it's clear that Elizabeth is not driven by wanting to make the world a better place or being an inventor. She's clearly just driven by money and her childhood dream of becoming a billionaire, and she will lie in order to get there. In 2009, this is when Sunny Balwani, her boyfriend, invests $13 million of his own money into Theranos and becomes the COO and vice president of the company. But by this point, everyone that she had employed from Apple has left. And in March of 2008, two high-level employees approached the chair of the board of Theranos with evidence that Elizabeth was misleading the board about the effectiveness of Theranos' technology. And the board decided to remove Elizabeth as CEO of the company. But somehow, with Elizabeth's continuous stream of lies and manipulation, it's able to convince them to change their minds. And then she proceeded to fire all of the members of the board and just replace them with new people, which is something she did a lot during her time at Theranos. She did not hesitate to fire employees whenever she felt like they weren't following her orders. It was clear that she didn't care about the people that worked for her, and they all kind of felt like they were easily replaceable and expendable. Now, of course, Elizabeth and Sunny, who's now the COO and vice president of Theranos, are a couple, but they kept that fact under wraps. They did not disclose the status of their relationship to anyone and acted just like work colleagues when they were around others. Sunny Balwani also didn't have any qualifications or background in medicine or technology, so between the two of them, there's absolutely no expertise in the field that they're in. It's also said that Sunny treated employees terribly. He was a bit of a bully and just very mean. So they sound like a lovely couple to work for. Employees at Theranos had to sign NDAs when they started working there, so they couldn't tell their friends and family what they did at work, and Elizabeth claimed that this was so other companies couldn't steal ideas from them. But employees were also forced to sign paperwork that said they wouldn't talk badly publicly about the company, and that if they did, they would be liable. They also kept the workers compartmentalized, so they weren't allowed to socialize with workers in other departments other than their own. Everyone in the building had a key card that they had to scan in order to access different areas of the building, which meant that Sunny and Elizabeth knew where everyone was at all times. And they even tracked all the emails that were being sent between the employees. And So because of all this compartmentalization and control, that's why it took quite a long time for employees to figure out that this whole company was just a complete farce and that the Edison didn't work. In 2012, Theranos moved their offices to the old Facebook building, which cost $1 million per month to rent. Also in 2012, Theranos struck a deal with Safeway, and they invested $350 million to refit 800 of their locations so it could offer Theranos blood testing in stores. In September of 2013, Theranos announced that they were going into partnership with Walgreens to launch in-store blood sample collection centers. By the end of 2013, Theranos hired Chiat Day, the same marketing company that Apple used to help market Theranos, which was a very expensive marketing company, and it's almost unheard of that a starter company would spend this much on a marketing campaign. Most companies would take a much cheaper option, but I think, again, because Apple used it, that's what she wanted. Eventually, Elizabeth appeared on the cover of Forbes magazine, where again she had a very similar look to Steve Jobs' Forbes cover. She's clearly pushing this image of being in the same intellectual lane as Steve Jobs, but actually she's just a complete fraud. And in 2014, Forbes ranked her number 110 and recognized her as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. And at this point, Theranos was valued at $9 billion, worth more than $400 million in venture capital. So by this point, a lot of aspiring female engineers, entrepreneurs, and scientists all really looked up to Elizabeth. But little did they know what was going on behind closed doors. In 2013, Dr. Ian Gibbons, one of Theranos' earliest employees and who had worked at the company for almost a decade and had medical qualifications, so he was an expert in his field, began confessing to his wife that the Edison machine wasn't working and that this was weighing heavily on him and started causing him depression. When his wife asked him if Elizabeth is telling the truth about the Edison, he said that Elizabeth lies about everything, and that he's surprised that she gets so much investment as there is nothing there to invest in. Dr. Gibbons was filled with anxiety over having to go to court on behalf of Theranos, in which they were having a dispute with Richard Fuse, who was Elizabeth's childhood next-door neighbour, actually, because Theranos would have to license technology from Fuse if they wanted to be able to implant a communication device into the Edison that would alert doctors to any issues with patients' blood test results, and Fuse owned the patent for this technology. And Dr. Gibbons was worried that he would have to lie on the stand because Elizabeth was pressurizing him to, and that if he did tell the truth, he would get into a lot of trouble. So tragically, just before he was due to be a witness in court, Dr. Gibbons took his own life. In autumn of 2014, Elizabeth moved Theranos to the Stanford Research Park in Silicon Valley, which is where some really big inventions have come to fruition, such as mainframe computers, microwaves, and even the International Space Station. This place claims that it is a community of and for the people who seek to invent the future. And many famous inventors such as Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Steve Jobs have spent time conducting research at this facility over the years. By Elizabeth's name appeared on 18 US patents and 66 foreign patents. During 2015, Elizabeth made agreements with Cleveland Clinic, Capital Blue Cross, and AmeriHealth Caritas to start using Theranos technology. In June of 2015, she even partnered with a Mexican businessman to help improve blood testing in Mexico. Then in July of 2015, Elizabeth had somewhat of a victory. Theranos had developed a test for detecting herpes, and this was the first and only Theranos test to ever be approved by the FDA. So naturally, she had a bit of a celebration over this. In 2015, Elizabeth was appointed as a member of the Harvard Medical School Board of Fellows and was also named one of Time magazine's most influential people in the world. She also received the Under 30 Doers Award from Forbes, and she went on to be named Woman of the Year by Glamour magazine, and also received an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from Pepperdine University after she delivered the commencement speech to the 2015 graduates, which is a prestigious non-academic degree awarded by universities to recognize individuals who have made significant humanitarian, philanthropic, or cultural contributions to society. At one point, Forbes listed her as one of America's richest self-made women in 2015 with a net worth of $4.5 billion. So, on the surface, things are going very well for Elizabeth. She was getting put on all these lists, being given awards, and really gained a name for herself. But in reality, it was all for nothing, because she hadn't achieved anything. Her invention did not work. And so, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. John Carreyrou, a journalist from the Wall Street Journal, got a tip from a medical expert who thought that the Edison device seemed suspicious. So, John decided to conduct a secret investigation into Theranos that lasted several months, where he spoke to a bunch of ex-employees and was able to get a hold of company documents that strengthened his suspicion. But eventually, Elizabeth found out about the investigation and got her lawyers involved, who threatened the Wall Street Journal and the former employees. But despite all these threats, in October of 2015, John decided to go ahead and release his article anyway. And the article revealed that the blood testing devices at Theranos didn't work, and that all this time, Theranos had actually been using traditional blood testing machines. Sometimes patients were brought in for blood work, where they would take way more blood than they advertised that they would, because it was only supposed to be a drop from your finger, but they would take the standard amount of blood that you would have to do when you go to your doctor. And they would come up with excuses for this, saying things like, oh, your doctor wants to run some special tests, so they require more blood, and it will need to be done the traditional way, even though they claim that the Edison can run 200 tests. So that must be some real special test if the Edison can't do it. So the article basically exposed Theranos as a giant fraud, which it was. The machines didn't work. It was too small to be able to run blood tests. It didn't have a centrifuge because Elizabeth claimed that such a small amount of blood doesn't require spinning to prevent coagulation. And the machine broke down a lot. They had to get people in to fix it, which posed a lot of health and safety threats due to the workers being exposed to people's blood. Also, the amount of blood this tiny pinprick was just not enough to gain results would come back absolutely crazy. Like, it would throw out some wild stuff. For example, some blood levels for things such as sodium would come back as if the patient was dead. It actually told a pregnant woman that she'd had a miscarriage, but she hadn't, and she didn't, and she went on to have a healthy baby. But she had suffered miscarriages before, which must have been awful for her to get that news when you've suffered multiple miscarriages, and then this test is telling you that you've had one, but you're still pregnant. And there were even instances where people got testing done at Theranos, had clear results, and then ended up developing cancer, which shouldn't have happened because Elizabeth claimed that Edison could detect all these kinds of diseases early. So it just goes to show that the machine, it doesn't work at all, not in the slightest, and Elizabeth had been exposed. She had been lying her way through from the beginning, and she was a classic example of fake it till you make it. Another thing that Elizabeth lied about was that the Edison was totally automated and produced results a lot faster than traditional testing. However, some employees came out and said that there were times when it would take over 6 hours just to set the machine up before they could even run the patient samples. Elizabeth went on to appear on the show Mad Money with Jim Cramer after the article came out, saying that it was completely false. She said, quote, "This is what happens when you work to change things. At first they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world," end quote. So she went into defense mode. In January of 2016, the Centre for Medicare and Medicaid Services did an inspection of Theranos' Network California laboratory, and they apparently discovered that there were irregularities with staff proficiency procedures and equipment. CMS ended up sending out a warning letter to Theranos because of what the inspection results showed. In February of 2016, Theranos announced that they would allow the Cleveland Clinic to complete a study on its technology on whether or not the results were even valid. And in March of 2016, a study appeared in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, and it stated that the company's blood test results were flagged outside of their normal range 1.6 times more often than other testing services. So CMS proposed that Elizabeth face a 2-year ban from owning or operating a lab because the company had not fixed the problems in its California lab, which ended up coming into place in July of 2016. And as soon as Theranos started coming under fire and speculation, Sunny Balwani upped and left the company, and he and Elizabeth ended their relationship. But she claims that she just fired him. Elizabeth went on the Today Show where she said that she was devastated because they had sold over 1.5 million blood tests to Arizonan citizens. And by 2018, the company had pretty much gone under. They had to fire a bunch of employees. They were under investigation. They had lawsuits at their door, and they were down to only 24 employees who were then fired by the end of the year. On June 15th, 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Elizabeth and Sonny on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And after the indictment was issued, Elizabeth stepped down as CEO of Theranos, but remained the chair of the board. On September 4th, Theranos made the announcement that they were going into liquidation, and the Wall Street Journal now reported that the company is completely worthless. Talk about a change of events. She went from being one of the most successful women in the world to one of the biggest frauds and failures of all time. During the time leading up to the trial, Elizabeth meets a man named Billy Evans, who is a 27-year-old inheritor to the Evans Hotel Group, and they start dating. So, another very rich man. She obviously has a type. They ended up having 2 children together, and when the trial started, she was pregnant with their 3rd child, which is just crazy to me that she would even consider having children, knowing that this trial was coming up and that she could very well go to prison for a long time. So that tells me that she's either super delusional and always has been, and thinks that nothing's going to happen to her, she's going to get away with all of it, or she's very narcissistic and thinks maybe that having children and being pregnant would go in her favour. You know, that people won't want to put a mum or a pregnant lady in jail. It's also insane that any man would actually want to date her because, you know, she's very well known for all the wrong things at this point. There's no way that he didn't know who she was and what she'd done. You know, just a quick Google search of her name would tell you everything. But perhaps he's a similar character to her. On January 3rd, 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty of 4 counts of defrauding investors, 3 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And Balwani was found guilty in July of 2022 for all 12 counts of defrauding Theranos investors and patients that used their faulty lab tests. In November of 2022, after months of appeals from Elizabeth and postponing sentencing, she was finally sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in prison. Then in December, Sonny Balwani was sentenced to 12 years and 11 months in prison. Elizabeth entered prison at the end of May in 2023, and that's where she will remain until around 2031 if she is on good behaviour the entire time she's there. But if not, she will do her whole sentence, and if she has any slip-ups, she could be in there longer. But before she entered prison, she did an interview with the New York Times, where she appeared physically very different. She was no longer wearing the black turtlenecks or the red lipstick. She had this very natural, no makeup look about her, and was now referring to herself as Liz, and said that Elizabeth no longer exists and that she's a whole new person. But actually the interview reveals that she's pretty much the same. When the interviewer asks where she thinks she would be now if the article revealing the truth about Theranos had never come out, she replied saying, "We would have achieved our vision." So she was still either very delusional and really believed that they could make the Edison work, or she's just, like I said, maybe so narcissistic she can't admit because her boyfriend said, yeah, the voice. I don't know why she did that. So that's the wild case of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. I cannot believe, to be honest, how seemingly easily she was able to drum up all this investment, you know, millions and millions of dollars, into just an idea. She hadn't even shown that this